Would like to talk today about the jurisprudence that regulated the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the New World. And could we, la luce, and I would like to begin with images. And I think for us, even for us legal historians, images can be very important in understanding how the 15th and 16th century jurists understood the legal situation. I begin with this very unusual but particularly interesting map that, as you can see, is in Den Haag and was made in the 1530s by an unknown artist. And what I find so interesting about the map, this is the entire view of the map, and what I find so interesting about this map is this section on the top of South America. And here's a close-up, closer view of that top of South America. And here's a detail. Now, this talk is going to be very boring for me if you do not talk. If I do all the talking, this is not going to be interesting for me. So, what is your name? Felipa. You know, Boccaccio's Decameron has a wonderful story about Madonna Felipa. Do you know that story? Oh, I wrote a little essay about Madonna Felipa 35 years ago. And you should read the story about Madonna Felipa in Boccaccio's Decameron. So you have the perfect name, as far as I'm concerned. So Felipa, what do you see here? Now remember, this is 1530, in the first generation of the conquest, the discovery, and the beginning of the conquest of South America. And we don't know for sure who the artist is, who designed this map.
I think I saw two naked men. Maybe they are slavers. And the dress ones could be Spanish or Portuguese.
Do you think this figure, the soldier, who's obviously the guard, is he Spanish or Portuguese? Spanish. Obviously, you're absolutely correct. And why is he Spanish, Felipa?
They conquest the South America and try to exterminate all the natives there. I don't know. The naked men obviously are working, and the two of above are commanding the workers.
Yes, and these are the prisoners or the workers. It's hard to tell. And why is one of them dressed and one of them is, or two of them are not dressed? They're all working at something. And they seem to be prisoners. The guard with the gun on his shoulder seems to indicate that he is a guard of these people. But I have never been able to figure out, I've known about this painting or this map, painting of a map for a long time. I've never been able to figure out why this person is clothed and this person is naked and this person is almost naked. What does it mean? What do you think? Is your name Philippa?
No, Miriam. Miriam. Miriam.
Milium. Milium. Emilia.
No.
No? Mom, Milium. Milium. Why do you think?
I don't know, I was thinking about it. I don't know. They seem to be working, the ones who are not dressed, and the other one is looking to them.
Now, the one thing I'm pretty sure about, Milium, Milium?
Miriam.
Milium. No? Tell me again. Miriam. 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 The one thing that I did, or I have concluded from this, is in this very early stage. Now remember, this is a European. There's no question that this painter is a European. At this very early stage of the colonization and the conquest of South America, I think these people must be natives. You think? You agree with me? These three persons must be natives. Come on in. And yet, how are they portrayed? What is your name?
Francisco.
Francisco. Okay. My Italian is much better than my Portuguese. Francisco, what are they, how are they portrayed? The natives, these I think are indigenous Native Americans. But what do they look like?
They look like Europeans.
They look like Europeans. Bravo, bravo. I agree. They look like Europeans. And I'm intrigued by this because I'm going to show you a lot more European engravings in particular later in the 16th century, and the indigenous Americans no longer look like Europeans. The European conception, the European view becomes less and less Eurocentric and more viewing these people as being on the margins outside of Europe. And to a certain extent, this is true of law and the jurisprudence that regulates the relationship between Europeans and indigenous Americans. And I would make one more point to begin. And the point that I would make is that there's a difference, a profound and a sad difference between the way in which the Spaniards, the evil Spaniards, and the Portuguese treated Native Americans and the way in which Native Americans were treated in North America by the English and the French. And my theory is, I'll tell you my theory right at the beginning, my theory is that the jurisprudence that governed the Spanish and the Portuguese offered far more protection to the rights, the legal rights of indigenous peoples than English common law offered to the indigenous rights of indigenous people. And so what do we have? I would make the argument, and I think I'm right about this, I would make the argument that in North America, and particularly the United States of America, there was in the 18th and particularly the 19th century, and it continued up until approximately the middle of the 20th century, we had in North America what was essentially genocide. Now, I'm not saying that the Spanish and the Portuguese treated indigenous people wonderfully, but when you compare the number of indigenous peoples that are still alive in Central and South America and compare them to the number of indigenous peoples alive in the United States of America, there is a vast, vast difference. I became interested in this problem, or why don't you sit up? No, you can't sit over there. You have to sit here. I became interested in this problem when I was as young as you are, Philippa. I was writing my PhD dissertation, and as part of my studies, I, for the first time, stumbled across somebody whom you all know, Bartolomé de las Casas. And I found some really intriguing elements in Bartolomé de las Casas's treatises in which he dealt with the rights of native indigenous Americans. And so I wrote the very first essay, or I should say the very first publication that I wrote was back 1970, what is that? Oh God, it's 46 years ago. Terrible. In any case, I wrote the article or the essay on Bartolomé de las Casas, in which I made the argument that I just outlined for you. The main point of the article was that European continental jurisprudence was a tool and was far more adaptable and important for protecting the rights of Native American peoples who had been conquered then was English common law. So the argument is that law, at least in this area, but I would argue all areas, law can have a profound effect on how people are treated, particularly when we consider the rights of people. And I pointed out in this essay that the first inkling or the first evidence that we have of the rights of non-Christian peoples, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about what rights do non-Christians have. You may notice in the current election in the United States, there are some candidates for president who think that non-Christian peoples have no rights at all. But the very first evidence that we have where the jurists, European jurists on the continent, now remember I've made a distinction between English common law and continental law, which I call, well, which we legal historians call the jus commune. That in the jus commune, particularly in canon law, that the jurists began to discuss the question of the rights of non-Christian peoples. And the first jurist to do that was Pope Innocent IV, who was a very good pope, I would say. When he commented on a decretal of Innocent III, the one on the top of the screen, he raised the issue for the first time in European jurisprudence. What are the rights of non-Christians? Now, what's interesting about this from the point of view of law students is that Innocent III's decretal had nothing to do with the rights of non-Christian peoples. It only had to do with the rights of crusaders, of Christian crusaders who went into battle against non-Christians. But it's an interesting example of how you law students, you're a law student?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is your name?
João Pedro. João Pedro.
Juan Pedro.
Yeah.
Come questo Pedro?
Yeah.
Juan Pedro. Juan Pedro, it's an example of how jurists, lawyers, should always be thinking about all the different aspects of a particular legal problem. And the jurists of the jus commune, like Pope Innocent IV, were really, really good at thinking about the larger picture, the larger problem. And you see here, I give you already, this Native American does not look like a European. Already, although it has a very nice classical look. It's not a negative image, I would argue. It's not a negative image, but it's no longer an image that looks like a European. Maybe an ancient Greek or an ancient Roman, sort of, but not a European. Anyway, from this point on, the jurists began to discuss, when they discussed Innocent III's decretal, they began to discuss